And we are live. It is Freedom Friday. Chris Stewart and our guest today, you know him, the illustrative, the brother, Sharif El-Mekki.
Hey man, Freedom Friday. I love the sound and ring of that. I love its meaning. And yeah, Freedom Friday it is.
Freedom Friday, man. We should use this day every week to give people something to think about over the weekend. Send them links, books, shared sources of information. So today we're going to follow up on where we were last week. Last week we were talking about, I think we always talk about Black education for liberation. We talked more globally last week, but this week we're going to narrow down in a period of time. And the period of time that we think is really interesting to start with, if we're talking about Black education, is the period right after emancipation. And there was somewhat of a really vibrant time between the end of slavery and the beginning of the 20th century. So think in the late 1960s, so 1970 to probably about 1920, 1930 was a golden age of the emergence of Black education as a formal system for the masses in the United States. So,
absolutely.
What do you think is a good place to start, Brother El-Mekki? We talked about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think to jump into that without at least touching on what preceded that. And that was that desire to learn even during enslavement, despite, that level of oppression, how important it was, if there was a singular enslaved Black person who knew how to read, they were like, the Pope or whatever the grandest, situation could be for particular people. And the idea, like, how, and of course some of them were caught, but most of them were held in high regard and in secret, because it was such, and it was across plantations. Like, if you were on one plantation, knew how to read, several of the surrounding plantations knew that you could read. You could read them Bible passages. You could maybe write them passes if they needed to go see their loved ones. You could get them news. But I think the singular thing was that it was an exact opposition to this idea that Black people could not learn, right? It was a proof point.
Yeah. And, so let's stick on that point for a second, just to say that made it overwhelmingly a common thing amongst Black folks to understand that education, more specifically reading, was power.
Absolutely.
Like, the ability to have that skill was something that people were hungry for and thirsted for and held in high regard, not for any other reason, not for any more important reason than they thought that it was the thing that could free them.
Yeah.
Because of that, because they saw it as the thing that could free them, Black or white slave owners and the white supremacists saw it as the biggest threat.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So an educated Negro was the biggest threat. A reading Black person was the biggest threat.
Yeah. And when you look at that power dynamic, so you have these plantation owners who would have, and this is pre-public schooling, right? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, like how that evolved. But so they would have tutors for their individual children. The folks that they employed, the white people that they employed, or the white people who benefited from this or thought they benefited from this slave system, patrollers, overseers, many of them were illiterate. So to have a human being who they didn't think is a human being, who thought they were less than, I can't read as this white overseer or this, what they call patty rollers, these patrollers, the origins of the police department. I can't read, but to have somebody who I viewed as subhuman to be able to read was just like, a violation on so many of the social norms that they were trying to establish. Yet Black folks were persevering through. You had, white children sometimes teaching them, sometimes white women. Sometimes it was this, a doctor talked about, like, oh, I taught my enslaved person to read because he needed to know the addresses to drop off things and things like that. So you started just having, for all these different ways of Black people learning, getting that literacy skills, and using it, not keeping it to themselves, but sharing and showing, and each one teach 1,000, right?
I think that's a big point too, is that learning was a collective, collaborative aim and goal. It wasn't one person thinking I need to educate myself. It was everybody thinking we need to become educated as a group if we're ever going to be free. So I need to do my part. I need to learn and I need to teach. One thing that's interesting is a story that I remember with Frederick Douglass, who said that like little white kids he would kind of trick them into giving them lessons. I don't know if it's tricking, but he would give them little things like, here's a little something, teach me how to read. And he would do it in brief stints on errands, right? Like, he'd be running somewhere, and that's not uncommon. If you read the literature, you find a lot of older Black folks who are in care of younger white kids, who the younger white kids would teach them, how to read or anything. What's so important about that, Sharif, to me is that's a historical fact. But if we just fast forward, and we'll go back to time again after I say this, to today,
right?
We have so much going for us today, and we pretend like we can't learn to read, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you had people on errands during slavery, in the worst, most traumatic, impoverished times in Black history, in the United States at least, learning to read in snippets, not from teachers who went through the colleges of education, but from little white kids learning to read. Yeah. And today we act like that's not possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a big part of it is like how reading used to be taught. This is something that I definitely want to look into more, but I would imagine it had a lot to do with phonics. It had a lot to do with spelling out words, trying to make sense out of them, at least all the regular words. And at some point, that got hijacked, and people was like, that's not important. It's not important to teach that way. And it got discarded in a whole new way. And there's certain children, there's a group of children who will learn how to read any way that you teach them. They're just able to absorb it. There's another group of students who need some very specific, the phonics. And I think that was a part that got lost over the years. You see now with the science of reading and this rekindling of this, reading wars, so to speak. You're seeing more evidence of like, a curriculum devoid of phonics for the younger youth is not setting young Black children up. And you have to almost, I remember when teaching Black children how to read, you have to understand how to teach bilingual students how to read. Because many of them speak, Black colloquialism or Black English, and it's a dialect unto itself. And if you're trying to teach and you don't understand that dialect, it's going to be much harder for you to teach.
I think that'd be interesting to go back in time and see how they were teaching so fast. There's this quote I told you before we got on today about that time period, that says, after the war, every former slave became a learner, every person a teacher, and every place a school, which meant that there was intergenerational learning. There were grandparents and grandkids under trees, in ditches, in churches, in basements, in houses, in stores, in storefronts, and wherever, doing all they could together to learn. They each became a learner and a teacher. They were passing it on with each other. So when you think about the fact that they were so successful in that period of time, because what we know for a fact is that the acquisition of literacy post-emancipation for the 20 to 40 years was the largest acquisition of literacy in human history, right? Which is amazing, right? And it was done at a time where we didn't have big colleges of education. We didn't have big workforces of people that were professionally trained. And I wonder what the lesson is for us from that today, that was done back then differently than what we do now.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of a quote, one of the quotes that makes me think of is Booker T. Washington during his time immediately afterwards, and just this hunger and this desire and this push for education for everyone, not just school-age children. Everyone who did not have it was looking to achieve it. Everyone who knew 3 words was teaching the person who knew 2 words. It was this whole idea, I think, of spirituality, of community, of family, and of just this fervent desire to say, like, nah, we've been human. We didn't just become human once we were we were liberated from shackles. We've been these human beings, right? We've always had this moral superiority. And a lot of I was reading in this book, Deep Like the Rivers, that speaks about education during enslavement. And it talked about how many Black people not only felt they had a moral superiority, they just felt like Black superiority, period, because of, you know what, wait a minute, you can't care for yourselves, you're too lazy to work, you turn into brute savages because you have this power over us, yet we are the moral compass here. And so that translated even to afterwards, like this idea of like, we are a community, we're fending for each other and ourselves. But Booker T. Washington down there said, few were too young and none too old to learn. Few were too young and none too old. Like, and that just says everything, right? Like, very few were too young. It means they're so tiny. They were the only ones that were not learning. And I don't care if you're 90 years old, you're learning. You never step foot in in that kind of space, educational space, but there's space for you.
You mentioned the bilingual thing, and as I speak now, I for my longest time have been trying to learn a couple of languages, and it just seems so hard now that I feel old, right? It just seems so hard. The older I get, it seems so tough. Like, and I look at it and I think this should be easy, especially with all the tools that I have. But everything that you read in the literature back then, you had 80-year-old people and 85-year-old people still alive who were learning their alphabet for the first time and learning the construction of words and sentences for the first time. And I just can't imagine being successful at that. And they were. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and you take people who were risking life and limb prior to that to learn how to read. Now, the ability to, where it was not that it was unfettered, because they still had, many challenges, but they were still, it was more open space to do that. And they took advantage of it.
Do you think it would be fair or unfair to say that maybe Black folks wanted it more than, a part of this might be the will of the people to learn at the time may have been more profound than it is today?
You know what? I think one, there were less distractions. But I think a bigger piece of it, there was not a system for you to distrust deeply. There was this enslavement system, right? So that obviously grew a lot of distrust, but there was not a public school system for you to distrust. It was just education. You were learning from your brothers, you were learning from your community members, you were learning from some white Northerners, right? Like, but there was not a system that in itself, and at least initially, to subject you to, to a mindset like, yo, I can't get down with you. You represent, another type of oppression. It was this period in between two major systems. The only thing that transcended both was the racism, like why it was still hard for them to acquire education.
So, I mean, so when I hear that, I'm hearing a slight romance with the idea that things were better before a system. Is that, are you kind of saying that the system that was put in place actually became partially problematic, even as it was attempting to help us advance?
Yeah, I do. When you look at, we've talked about this with the education of Blacks in the South, when they talk about how once it became a system, there were white Northerners or even planters who sometimes invested and just thought they'd be a better workforce if they're slightly educated. They were infuriated a lot of times where they saw so much evidence that Black parents preferred private schools completely run by Black people, as opposed to the free public school system that they were trying to set up. And they couldn't understand it. They were just like, this is free. You're broke. You're pulling together, a penny here, a nickel here.
Yeah.
And they still showed this preference, for one type of education. That gets lost over the century, right? Like that gets lost. I think there's still something to that. The trust, the mindset of why are you educating? Is it really for liberation, or is it so that you can, buy something from me, or you can work for me and be a better worker? Like, what are the reasons? What are the deep foundational reasons for it? And I think that has played out into these systems over the years.
I think from the very earliest times you see with Black folks, if you just read between the lines, they were always shrewd about what opportunities were before them. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. You could bring them a system and they'd be like, oh yeah, let me see what's the best in that system and I'll take it. And I'm still going to be skeptical of you. Right. So that probably happened with every system, with the white teachers that came down from the North. Black folks saw all the utility of them and also weren't ignorant about, the reality of them, like where they had shortcomings. Same things with the schools that they brought, and eventually the system that they brought into place. If you're listening to this or you're watching this, Sharif just mentioned the book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. I dropped that into the feed here so that you can have a look at that book. It's seminal to the discussion that we're having right now. It actually is a great kind of basic primer of all you need to know about the beginning of Black education in the United States. I don't know if you would agree with that, Sharif, but I feel like it's foundational.
Oh, yeah, no. Absolutely. Encourage folks to come on. We've been working with our Pantheon. Dr. Cole has been leading a book discussion on Saturday afternoons, I believe 4:00, on this book. And I think it's absolutely critical for anyone interested, any educator, first of all, and then anyone interested in education to read that, because it has in there, you see some of the narratives that are around today about Black children, about Black education, about Black families, and you can see the genesis of it, or the direct link of it, from enslavement times and immediately afterwards. It is like you could almost, many of the pages, you could almost imagine it being in your local newspaper today.
I mean, it does sound like a newspaper from the past that still, you have to look at the date of it and say to yourself, when did this happen?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Even something as simple as at one point, I believe it was in Louisiana, the people in charge, the white people, a lot of, decided that, you know what, we don't have the funding to educate these Black people, so we're just shutting down the schools. So they shut down the Black schools because they could not afford, and we already know the underfunding and all of this kind of stuff. This independent, almost you were on your own, for Cole's quote, right? Like that's what they felt. Then for them, and then what they realized, they was like, the Black people were so angry, like they didn't understand, like they lit this bonfire of sentiment because and like, why wouldn't they be upset? But it just shows, like, right from the beginning, like, oh, one, that underfunding of schools that are Black, the Blacker they are, the less funding that they're going to get. That has historic origins in this country.
It's interesting to me that you see such hostility, white hostility to Black education, Black schools, Black teachers. And one just symbolic way to see that come about is that a lot of times that white folks in local communities would burn down schools, Black schools. But they'd leave the church standing. So what does that tell you? They leave the church. They wouldn't burn the Black church.
Sometimes.
Right? Sometimes, let me be clear about, like, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but I've read enough stories where the school was the first thing to get burned down. Like it was the target of white anger, right? It wasn't, later it became the Black bank and the Black store and the Black business. But before that was the target of anger and hostility. It was usually the Black school. Teaching those Negroes to learn was the thing that was threatening.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the there's a quote in The Education of Blacks in the South where there was this planter, and he said, all those Negro kids go to school and the county has to pay for that. So he's telling you, like, why are we paying for them to be educated? Like, it was such an affront to his sensibilities, that Black children were being educated and the county at large with taxes, not just white taxes, like everyone's taxes, was footing it. Because if you look at history, many of the systems, Black people were paying taxes for white students.
That's right. That's right.
Right. But not their own.
That's right.
And so that's that same system. You work for our benefit. Your existence is for our benefit. You're not our equal.
And I don't want to pay for you. That's kind of like something they've given us all along is, why should I pay for your freedom?
Exactly.
Through taxes. It was interesting because I was just watching a documentary in preparation for this discussion today about the Rosenwald schools, which come along a little bit later. And we discussed this last week a little bit with Booker T. Washington is asked by Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was very wealthy, over $100 million he had, I think, in relative dollars back then. He was also the president of Sears and Roebuck Company at that time, or the chairman of Sears and Roebuck. And he asked Booker T. Washington what he thought would be the highest value. Like, what is the thing we could do that would give us the biggest value? And Booker T. Washington told him, without a doubt, elementary schools. Like, we just need to build a ton of elementary schools. It turned out that Julius Rosenwald gave a little over $4 million to the project, but he demanded that local people raise their own dollars. So Black people themselves in very poor communities also raised $4 million. As a matter of fact, they raised more than he gave. So it was above 4 million. Local white taxes, which were on the hook for part of this too, only gave $1 million in total. Right. So Black folks poor Black people across the South outraised the government and local white folks and even the philanthropist. Right. Because, it was probably about a $10 million or so project. They built the schools. They used their own dollars, coins, nickels to do it. They elected their own teachers. They set the curriculum in those schools and they ran and operated them from a community perspective. They even housed the teachers, right, of that time. Think about that model in a time where those communities couldn't have been more depressed economically, couldn't have been more like beat up, and couldn't have been under greater racism. And it's things like that you learn about our own history that you have to ask questions about today, right? Like, you have to ask, if they could do it then, what is our problem today? Do you think it's wrong to try and make that connection between what people did way back then and what they do today?
No, absolutely not. I think at that time it was very crystallized in a lot of people's minds because of their experiences that they were a community within a country. And so this idea of self-reliance and independence and self-determination was very acute. It was like, very clear to every single person that was a thing. I think over the years, what happens is, the community, there were a lot of people that were invested in this idea of seducing Black people to believe that you don't need your own community anymore. You're a part of us. We are all part of this.
Oh, don't you start, bruh. Don't you start. Are you about to go into integration? Are you about to say integration now?
And even before that, I'm going to say like, hey, you know what? You're part of the country when we need you to be. So we're going to send you over to die in wars, but don't come back here thinking that you're our equal. You can die for me, but you're not my equal, right? But over time, people started really thinking about, hey, you know what? Maybe the better way is for us to just forget about our community within this country and just try to be a part of the country. And I can understand from a philosophical point of why, but from a logical point, it is almost death for Black communities to lose that, right? And that's why you see there's still a thread of that for many Black people with, Black independent schools or homeschooling or, whatever means that they can do to kind of create that community, that family, that sacred, aspect of it.
What do you think about the idea that they were focusing more narrowly on the big things that they thought could get us ahead? Like, for instance, in that time period, the ability to read opened up a big world. So the massive focus was on reading, getting everybody up to speed on reading. And And when you get in later on, you get into the argument between Du Bois and Washington, where Washington is saying we need to teach nation building skills. We need to teach how you build a house, how you build bricks, how you make your own means of production, how you own capital, how you buy buildings. Du Bois was basically saying, no, we need to think about educating the best of us to get our civil rights, right? I think the rift there, I think, is Washington really believed that your civil rights come with owning things, right? Like, and I think Du Bois was more, it comes through law. But Du Bois's rip on Washington was that he was being too narrow. He was thinking too narrowly about a handful of things. Like, he just like the previous folks just thought about reading. They didn't think about learning Latin and science and all that yet, because they felt like, no, we can't learn any of that if we don't know how to read. What do you think about the narrow focus at a time versus those folks who would argue for a broader focus?
Yeah, you know what? I'm not trying to cop out, but I fall in the middle. Like
that's cop out.
Yeah, but listen why. But I'll give some explanation why. I think when you read some of Booker T. Washington's one, I think the disparaging that he gets sometimes from the community should really, people should really check themselves. They should really dive deeper into like what was he doing. At the end of the day, 5,000 schools, like that's unheard of. It's still like a colossal feat from someone who just came out of enslavement, and to be able to decide, like, and he made the right call. Schools was the number one thing that was needed. I think what people were nervous about, particularly in the South, where it was already this caste system, that education wasn't going to help people move out of that caste system without some other pushes, legal pushes and other things like that. Because you can all know how to be a carpenter, know how to build homes, and the white system itself would still say, like, yes, and we're barely going to pay you, we're barely going to do this, we're barely going to do that. So it was either just totally separate yourself and only do for self. But if there was any interaction with the other communities in the larger town and white folks in general, then you needed something else to protect you, right? And
yeah. So if I'm thinking hindsight is 2020, and this is my cop out, because I get to look at history from behind me now, right? Yeah, so it's exactly. 2020. If I had to go back in time and put my bet on either Washington or Du Bois, I'd put my money on Washington, hands down. Like, no doubt about it. I put my money on him. And this is why. Because
it's hard to dispute that. I mean, it's hard to argue.
I mean, him coming out of slavery, first of all, and then if you read up from slavery and you see everything he did to get to where he was at, to where he owned some things in life, it was all like the same draw my grandfather had, which was there was a hustle there. There was amount of understanding, like what the real goalpost was, like how you own things and get to write your own ticket in some ways based upon what you know and what you own. But the reason that I would put all my money on him was he was a builder. And he believed, if you look at the difference between him and Du Bois believed in the law. Du Bois believed that he believed in the Constitution and the law, and that voting and voting systems and all of that could make us free. And what we still know today is that even the right to vote doesn't stop people from suppressing your vote. Doesn't stop them from rigging the voting system, doesn't stop you from having a presidential Democratic Party that has an all-white ticket, an all-white, all-owed ticket that owes its entire existence to the black vote. Damn near, maybe I'm overstating it a little bit, but but with that, you take black folks out of the mix and you don't have an all-white ticket on the Democratic side. You don't have a Democratic side, period, right? And that's with the vote after all of these years. The one thing you can't contest is if you own something, like every immigrant group that ever came to America saw owning something as the big deal. That's a power that speaks for itself, right? Like let's be real. We're in a capitalist country. Capital speaks. Everything else is kind of like wavy gravy, right? So that's my argument for, if we had from the beginning taken Washington's path, which is build your own, own it yourself, determine what it is for yourself, call it what it is, determine what the curriculum will be, what the pedagogy will be, what your children will learn, when they will learn it, how they will learn it, who will teach it to them. If you control all of those things, you control the Black brain and the Black mind. I don't know. Fight me on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to
fight me on it.
I mean, when you term it like that, it's hard to fight, right? Like I say this often. Like if I couldn't create 100, I couldn't even fathom 5,000. But if I could create 100 schools that were similar to the elementary school that I went to from kindergarten to sixth grade or first grade to sixth grade, like that would be it, right? Just having a pre-K to sixth grade institution and 100 of them that I know for certainty that the Black child and the Black brain would be safe into not only safe, but they would be empowered and infused with this, this fervent desire to support their communities, to push back, to resist, and to elevate the needs of their community. Like I do that in a heartbeat. I think, but there's something telling about when we look at this history. There were people in Booker T. Washington's camp who said, like, this is not enough. So not just looking at it historically from our perspective, there were people that were educated on his, in his system that still felt like, you know what, this is not enough.
I know, but what's so ironic about that is there were people in
they were
his
secretly
system.
doing that. They were secretly adding things to his curriculum.
Well, this is my point, is like there were people within his system that were secretly doing that. Right.
Yeah.
Like my point is he created the bubble of which Du Bois was a great dude. Right. And if you read him, he was great. But really, he appeals to the Black bourgeoisie for a reason, because he had big ideas and thoughts, but nobody was coming out of the school of Du Bois. There is no school of Du Bois. Right. Like, so it's like it's my rip on him all the time is great for Black intellectuals to go back and read him as Black intellectuals so they can feel superior to the masses. But what you just said to me is brilliant. It's perfect, because even within Booker T's Washington, he was educating people who were going to improve his own thinking. Like the education of like we still, out of the HBCUs still today, we graduate the highest number of people that go on to even challenge the system, his own system, right? Some of the people challenging Washington today came out of Washington schools, I guess is my long-winded point of making, right? Like, and I think he's fine with that. What a lot of people don't know is that Washington was saying one thing publicly, and he was funding civil rights lawsuits privately.
It was a little part. He had the means to do that, right?
Like, means to do it.
Yeah, I mean, like if you have a vision to create 5,000 schools for our people, I just don't see an argument against that. Right. My only like nuance to that piece is just like, yes, those 5,000 schools and add a little bit of XYZ, but at the end of the day, 5,000 schools is 5,000 schools, and particularly not just the schools, but he's a superhero because of the times and conditions that he was able to establish that. Yeah. And I don't want to get lost. Like even outside those 5,000 schools, there were schools, hundreds of schools that they called native schools that had no support from white philanthropy. That was just created and just said, you know what, this needs to happen, right? And so there's stories of like, two educated Black folks who say, you know what, we're going to start a school, and they just like a lantern to moths. They were able to have a student body of 150 students, right? They knew nothing about creating a school, but they knew we have to create a school, right? And so in addition to those schools, that it was kind of in this, what they call, like, I think the Tuskegee experiment, not the other Tuskegee experiment, but like Tuskegee schools.
Right.
Yeah, Tuskegee schools. I think I missed the term, but these schools that was based on Booker T. Washington's philosophy. Yeah. There were another, like these far more independent schools that were just saying, like, you know what, I know how to read, you know how to read, let's start a school. And we have to remember, like, we're talking about rural land, right? And we're talking about like where you may not see, a town for days of traveling, on foot. And so like what happens in those spaces as well.
You know, there's all these movies like sci-fi movies and others where the plot of the movie is how you go back in history and you change one thing and how it has a butterfly effect. It like makes everything in the world change because you change this one little thing in history. Matter of fact, in a lot of the sci-fi movies, they tell you if you go back in time, don't move anything or misplace anything because it'll ruin the whole world, right?
Yeah.
Like they tell you
You been
don't.
watching Marvel lately? Like,
Don't go. Yes, Thanos stuff too. You know, the only reason I say that is because as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, you know, Black folks have had to make decisions of where to put their bet at different times, and what if they had stuck with the building of Black schools, the building of Black education, Black educators, Black pedagogy, self-determined education, if that had been the thing that they stuck with, and didn't swing wildly to this integration thing.
Seduction is hard to resist, you know, no matter what type of seducing it is, right? It appeals to you emotionally. You know that it's like, yes, in a utopia, we want everybody just to, you know, just treat everybody like human beings, the golden rule, right? Like all of that. But that's why I think education is so political. You also have to understand what is the context that I am in, what is the context my children will be in. That's the path that I'm going to use for education, right? There's this, one of my favorite quotes was this idea that, you know, or the sentiment rather, that Black people were, at least early on, and still now, but like, you know, at that time, it was so just concentrated. This idea that we have to secure our freedom with the intelligence to maintain it. Right? Secure our freedom with the intelligence to maintain it. And I would couple that with that intelligence is also the people to maintain it. The Black teachers, the Black educators, the Black philanthropists, you know, the Black community. Like that's what's going to secure the freedom. Right. And I think at some point we said we can secure our freedom and by just going in and jumping into everywhere else, right? Like and integrating is going to secure the freedom. Where a lot of pushback is, you know, the civil rights movement in a lot of ways, you know, which was the birth child of, you know, Brown versus Board in a lot of instances was more of a consumer rights than a human rights.
You know, what you just said is so deep, though. Like, so if you secure your freedom, so that's emancipation, you secure your supposed freedom, and then you need the people to maintain your freedom. So that's your early wave. Our first educators were Black women. Let's just be real. The majority, if you go back and you read, I just talked about Booker T. Washington for a long time, but if you go back and read all of the literature, all of our early educators were Black women who one, had become educated themselves, and two, saw it as part of their mission for racial uplift to be teachers, right? Like their draw to education was they saw it as a revolutionary act, like a thing that they could contribute to the race to uplift the masses. So now you have the freedom and you have the people. But the thing that comes after that isn't that infrastructure. Like you have to have a focus on building infrastructure to maintain both the people and the knowledge and the freedom over time. And we never really got there in terms of owning all of it ourselves, the infrastructure. As a matter of fact, we gave up some of the infrastructure over time.
Yeah. Infrastructure is like what protects. When you think about infrastructure, it's like what protects, right? A building protects what's within. Right. And so the gate protects your yard. Like the infrastructure is what would protect the freedoms that the capital that we were able to gain, the education, the systems that we were trying to develop. Like that's what would, you know, kind of created this cocoon that allows, you know, the metamorphosis of the community to continue.
You mentioned something earlier too about education being political. You know, those would be political entities, like Black schools with Black educators would be. Yeah, that would be. So it would actually serve more than just the purpose of education. It would actually serve the purpose of something bigger than education too, if we had kept that going.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, there were complaints, you know, and again, you know, right out after enslavement when schools were happening, there were complaints from, you know, wealthy white people that Black folks wanted to help, but they didn't want anyone to undermine their self-reliance and self-determination. Now, this was a complaint, like this is a formal complaint about a group of people. Like, yeah, they want our help, but they want to remain independent. Like, why wouldn't they? And when, you know, that's the same thing that you want, you know? And so I think when you look at that from an educational component, That's where those politics, you need that, and if whether it's taxes, whether it's grant, whether it's technical support, and as you said early on, using the tools that benefit you, but also maintaining what else benefits you, and that's your ideology about yourself, about your people, about your community. That shouldn't be, put up to butcher for more tools.
You mentioned tools. It always makes me think of the Audre Lorde quote of you can't. I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's kind of like you can't use.
That's all right. I do it all the time.
Yeah, I know you do. That's why I feel in open company to be able to say it. The quote is along the lines of you can't use the master's tools to tear down the master's house. And I always think that is so wrong. Like you could use any tool for revolution, any tool. This is the one thing that we've learned in our history was anything that you gave to people who wanted their freedom, they could pick it up and use it as a weapon to free themselves. Right. The most ironic tools they would take, and use for their freedom. And the ownership of the system of education is one of those tools in which I think we gave up. We just gave it away. We ceded it to other people in the hopes that they would see us as equal and then treat us as equal. And I think that was a fool's errand. It doesn't make sense that we would trust that.
I mean, you said a big part, like hope. Hope is not a strategy that you can rely on,
wow.
Right? If there's not been evidence, right? People are going to show you, what Maya say, believe them the first time. When someone shows you who they are, they've shown you thousands of times.
Yeah.
Right? Like the system is not built for you.
Yeah.
And even when we talk about equity now and this buzzword, it's usually like window dressing to a building created on a foundation of stench, oppression, racism. And so we add a couple window dressings and say, look, now everything is good. Like, no, it's the same system. Don't get tricked.
Well, about that. So let me give you a problem in that then. Let's talk about some actors and players in this. So, because we still need to look at these actors and players today when we think about it at Black education. So we know that the people who are hostile to our education, let's just take them out of the mix because they exist and they've always existed and they're like rain. We just expect them like the weather to come and do what they do, right? But then you have the saviors or the friends, allies, co-conspirators, whatever you want to call them. And there's an analog between who they were back in those days, like the American Missionary Society and the Quakers and the Northern industrialists who brought teachers down to the South, right? So, and today there would be an analog to who those people are today, or the people who come to help us educate ourselves while they're still holding on to the money and the infrastructure and whatnot, but they're here to help us. Okay. And then we have the Black bourgeoisie, who back then would have been the ones selling the masses hope. If we can only get the vote, they'll see us as equal. If we only can integrate with them, they'll see us as equal. If we can only join them in some meaningful way, they'll come to know us and they'll see us as equal. And then there were the Black masses who were like, I got to eat next week. Tell me what you're talking about in terms of brass tacks. Tell me about hard facts, like things like, because this all sounds good. Oh, you're here to help me? Oh, that sounds good, right? And then they bring the Black bourgeoisie with them and they're like, oh, so you're here with them to help me. Okay, all right, cool. Let's do this. In the back of their mind, being super realistic, knowing that you have to treat all these people with scrutiny. All right, so that's a big mess. There's not really a question in there, but tell me about, what you think about that dynamic, the way that I laid it out. You've got the people that are hostile, take them out of the mix. The white allies, co-conspirators, including philanthropists and teachers, educators, and whatnot. Their relationship with the Black bourgeoisie and the Black bourgeoisie's relationship with the Black masses. What do you see in that mess from then and now?
Yeah, I see back then, and I've spoken about this before, the Black wealth, or folks that had made it the middle class, et cetera. Philadelphia was known for that type of situation. They still look down on their brothers and they're like, oh, that's ignorant. That's not us, right? I'm different. I'm educated. They're beneath me, just like they're beneath you. And so they tried to find this brotherhood, this sisterhood with those in power who still would never look at them that way. And so you see a little bit of of that same, not a little bit, you see a lot of the same thing, where there's complexities of interactions between folks and trying to determine what is the next step forward. I think at the end of the day, with all of that, you have to look at, like, what are people's intentions? Like, what are the intentions? And I'm going to always side on the community, right? Always, no matter what, I'm going to side on the community. Like, what benefits the community at large? What benefits the people at large? Like, to me, that's it. And I think sometimes you're going to have to, as Dr. Fuller says, this, congruent of influences, right? Of interests.
Convergent, convergence.
Interest convergence, right? Like that it comes together, that folks are deciding, like, okay, how do I move this forward? And you said earlier, no permanent friends, right? The permanent interest is the liberation of our Black children, the least of us having what they need to be full human beings, right? And until that happens, that's why I think the struggle has to continue, right? We have to figure out, okay, from the white allies, what can they offer that doesn't undermine what I'm trying to do? I think where we make mistakes sometimes is we'll put aside our own interest in the idea of that help, right? And so when they said back in the day, like, oh yeah, we want your help, but we're going to rely on our self-determination for the rest of it, that is the standard bearer. That's what we have to do.
I feel like the white liberal, the white progressive, has changed over time. And in those days back then, what would have been seen as the white progressive would have been the Quakers, or the American Missionary Society. And though they had problems, I actually still believe it holds up over time that, like, the Quakers were good people, like, even till today, like, all throughout slavery, civil rights, they've been consistent for years. If you look at their history in terms of white progressives of their time, right? Not that they're perfect. Nobody is. They had some issues.
Yeah, a lot of them had slaves too, but they were, at some point, they moved away from that. So yeah.
I mean, before everybody else did.
Yes.
Right. Like, before everybody else did, they were talking about Black suffrage, Black, humanity and all that stuff, and taking real material hits to do it, and harboring slaves, enslaved people, and all that stuff.
Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, William Still, the list goes on and on.
Yeah. All their best, like, conspirators were Quaker folks of the time. We mentioned earlier in this conversation about how people, like, in the old days, people hostile to Black education would say, why are we paying taxes to educate those people? Right. And now here comes a real
before, or is that from yesterday? Which one?
Right.
Which one?
Well, and this is my point. This is this is going to be the controversial point that I'm going to make. I make one in every time I talk. There's something I say that's terrible, But today's white progressive feels no problem saying to you, I don't want my tax money going to give your people educational choices that I don't like. Right. It's something they will say openly, directly to you. As a matter of fact, when you talk about school choice, Black folks being able to access private schools as the main vehicle of their education, or accessing schools that white liberals don't want you to access, they feel no problem using as their social controlling instrument being their taxes. And they will say to you, it's not that morally I don't think you should have the right to do it. It's just I don't want you to do it. And because I don't want you to do it, I don't want my tax money. First of all, as if we don't pay taxes.
Right.
Second of all, as if the nation doesn't owe us a debt that hasn't been paid. So don't talk to me about your taxes. Right. But that's a white progressive thing in modern times to be able to say now. Like,
if those are my friends, I don't need enemies, right?
I mean, damn, right? Like, and what lesson are we not learning about that in education right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, understanding our history, understanding their history, and understand our combined history, right? And so when we talk about, just how many people have warned us against the progressive, the white progressive, right? We can't enter I look at it sometimes as like two tents. You see these old pictures of two warring armies back in the day. They pitch two tents and then a table in the middle. Sometimes we forget that this is, we're still in that same scenario. It's painted differently, but it's the same thing. You got two tents with very different missions, very different ideas of what it means, right? This is why they can say, like, oh, I give money, but without this. When Black folks back in the day said, hey, I want your I'll accept assistance, without your control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing now. Like, yeah, I'll take your assistance, but don't tell me where to send my child, particularly if what you're offering does not meet the needs of my child. Right? What would people say back then? They would say that's an uppity Negro, that's an ungrateful Negro. That the tense are still here because that's the same language that's being used today. Oh, they don't know any better. They don't understand. I'm smarter than them. Me being a white man with money, I can better tell you what to do with your black child, despite the history that shows the exact opposite.
Darren Beck, who is an awesome watcher and supporter. Thank you, Darren, for always being with us. He asked the question, how seriously and genuinely do white allies avoid undermining? Sometimes it feels like we are sort of hardwired to muck it up. And I think what you just said is a piece of that about telling the helpers how they can help, setting some parameters. It is good that you have money and you've come to help, but there need to be some parameters, some humanity on our end to be able to determine how you help us, right? Like, just to come in and run the table.
I mean, the first part of wanting to be a helper is to say, what do you need? That's the first part.
Yeah.
That's the simplest, most human way of approaching it. Is like asking and respecting the answer, even if you disagree.
Oh, that's so deep. Yeah, that's true.
Right. But it's like, I want to help you, but only if you align with my own interests. That's not help.
Yeah.
That's not help.
I feel like the Rosenwald story is a story where Julius Rosenwald, first of all, let's say Julius Rosenwald was Jewish. And if you look into his psyche of why he came to help, it was because he understood oppression from his own people. And he understood the toxicity of white racism and just oppression just in general. That gave him a different orientation. So he asked the question of Booker T. Washington as if Washington is a valued more than just a thought partner, but an expert. Like he does. I don't know what your people need. Tell me what you think you need. Like, what could I give you that you could use? And that's where those schools come from. And it was very much in the control of Black community still to build those schools. Right. Like, we'll give you the money, but you go and build them. And, another analog to that is Lucy Craft Laney. We haven't talked about her today, but she's a Black educator from the early days who I like to always bring up because she's the first Black charter school leader that I can find in history. And it was in the late 1800s. She got a charter from the state of Georgia to start the first Black kindergarten, which eventually became the first Black K-8 system. And out of that first Black system came other educators like Mary McLeod Bethune and others. When she died, there were hundreds of people, including heads of state and presidents and whatever, at her funeral. She was that phenomenal in history. Lucy Craft Laney, her story of how she got the initial seed money to start her school was that she took a long train ride to Minnesota to come to the national conference. I believe it was the Presbyterian Church, to look for money, and they sent her home without the money. She made a big pitch. And didn't really get the money from them. But when she got home, somebody who had been there, a wealthy white woman named Haynes, her last name was Haynes, I forgot what her first name was, gave her the money that she needed, like sent her a big check, like a fat check. And it was just like kind of a gift, because it wasn't, I want you to set up this kind of school or do this kind of thing or teach in this kind of way. It was just straight up, here's the money. I believe in you and your vision and what you're doing, and go do it. And out of that came a long history of education. You've heard me tell this story before too, because here comes the rip of what I'm about to say. Right. The school that she started became a staple of the community and educated many Black people over many years. And it was destroyed in the 70s by what? Integration. Busing and integration killed this phenomenal Black school. That should be that. And she had started in the early days of education, and that school lasted all those years and became that phenomenal of an inspiration in the community, only to be destroyed, ironically, by the thing that the Black bourgeoisie bought into as being our saving grace, which was integration, which, folks, if you're listening, stop saying it's the only thing that ever worked, because it's the biggest thing you've invested in that didn't work, that destroyed Black education. Anyways, that's my speech for today. Fight me on it or add to it. Tell me what you think. I want you to always push back on me when I say that, because it's terrible. I say it all the
I mean,
time. And people hate it.
yeah, but people hate it. But is it terrible? Like, I mean, historical facts that, and how things how things were created. What does co-optation look like? To me, it'd be different if the integration that was pushed for people was actually about equity. It was actually about educational justice. Was actually about, as you mentioned earlier, the debt that America owes its citizens of African descent, of Native American descent, right? Like it would be very, very different if that's what integration meant. But that's not what it means. That's not. It's hard to find that kind of space where people aren't coming out of those situations with real scars, emotional, physical, mentally, intellectually, right? It's hard to find this integrated society that, within a school where you can't find them in the city. You can't find them in the schools when you look at, okay, who takes the AP courses? Who takes if you actually think these children are brilliant, and you say my most brilliant are in these particular classes or have these particular teachers or is in this particular floor, why don't we see integration in that? Like, to me, go break it down to the least common denominator. Like, where is it consistent that they are treated as human beings? I talk about like the wealthy suburbs of Philadelphia, North Penn District, and Lower Merion, these other places that even today you would think these are things from the 50s. They're taking lawsuits, eating lawsuits because they're saying like, oh yeah, in 8th grade, despite the fact that Black child took algebra, we're not going to put them in the next level of algebra in high school. We're still going to put them in remedial math, regardless of what they did. You know what I mean? Like the actual track, regardless of what the child took. This is happening today. When the Human Rights Commission has to step in and have conversation, and this is in the so-called integrated communities. Like, no, that's not the same thing as actual belief in full humanity. And if you can't do it, acknowledge you can't do it. If you feel like, the racism is too entrenched in these systems, in the school system, then allow us to get the help and maintain our independence. Because at the end of the day, my rant all the time, every day, is we need more Black schools. We need more Black educators. We need more conscious white educators who understand how to help without the co-optation. And that is just a hard thing to get these days, just like it was extremely hard to get back those days. The help without the co-optation, I'll do this for you if you vote for me. I'll do this for you if you go to this type of school. I'll do this for not, oh, you're a human being, and even if you disagree, you're still a human being. The moment you disagree with them or want to show a little uppityness, you're less than a human being all over again.
And that's one of the big rips in people that critique the school reform movement, is that, as long as you agree with whatever narrow aim is of whatever funder that you're working with, you're good to go. And the moment that you disagree with it, you're not good to go anymore. You become kind of like a person without a country, because the other side, who want you just to keep you like cattle in the main system, actually have no interest in helping you, funding you to liberate yourself.
Let's see, but that goes back to my Booker T. Washington story. If Booker T. Washington had swayed at all, or some of his his proteges, when they were adding things, threats were made to cut off the funding. So it's still, even in that space, where it's given like a level of autonomy, but there's autonomy to maintain within this, paradigm.
But this is
he would travel to places and say, yo, you fired, bro, because you about to cut off the money. You know what I mean? Because why? Because you added literature. Adding literature, like, for real, adding higher level of science besides agricultural science. With so like that's the, like, we're in between a rock and a hard place, and all we could do is just keep fighting, like, at the end of the day, because like we're surrounded by it.
You know, I think that's a good pushback. But all I see in Washington is pragmatism.
Mhm.
Like I just see pragmatism. Like he's making a calculation to himself. What's most likely to get the most amount of power in the short amount of time with what we actually have, and not derail us from having that power grow, right? And I'll end with this on his story. I actually had a chance to stay in the first house that was built for the first president of his HBCUs, and it was built by the students of the HBCU. And I got to spend the night there, and the ghost of him is just like everywhere in there. His family, his descendants still run the house, still run the plantation, and they own it. Yeah, nice. So it's a bomb place to have like a retreat, like, right. And there's this tree there that has a stool underneath it, which is where Martin Luther King Jr. went for a respite to write the "I Have a Dream" speech, right? And it's still sitting there. So I was able to sit on that underneath the tree in this house that the Black students of Booker T. Washington built for the first HBCU president as a gift, you know, and for him to live in. And the people who run it today give you the story. They tried and failed over a period of time to develop the bricks that house was built with, and they mastered it at some point at a time where there were no Black brick makers, right? The mortar, the architecture, the design, the flooring, the way that it looks at the river versus not facing away from the river for a reason like air conditioning, and there was all this science behind it or whatnot. That all came out of Booker T. Washington's vision of what you should be taught and what you should be learning, right? And here's my point about it. Say what you will, but it still stands today. I was able to sleep in that house right now with what they built with their own hands, their own science, their own architecture, their own design, still standing. I am not able to sleep in the Du Bois built house today. That's my whole point about Black education. And that's why I rescue my man from the heap of history all the time.
Yeah, that's a powerful story and imagery. And I think, you know, as everything, there's, you know, complexities to this work. I do think Du Bois, particularly his how he evolved, he did leave you know, this intellectual North Star of how to do the work. And I think a lot of our giants, they may not have left something physical, right? But they leave not only aspirations, but they leave a blueprint, they leave a line of thinking, they leave this intellectual genealogy that I think is crucial to continue and combine with the infrastructures, the folks who left infrastructure, the folks who left you know, physical roadmaps, you know, to do.
I think that's huge. I'll take that point. That point is amazing. Just in, you know, I give Du Bois a hard time a lot of times, possibly because of the people who love him today get on my nerves so much. But the truth is, without him, you don't have social work. You don't have Black social work without Du Bois, right? So what you just said was like the intellectual lineage or the legacy that they leave behind is as big as a physical legacy. That's huge.
Yeah. And if we honor it, and I think that's part of our role as you know, nascent historians or, you know, like activists, like one, you can't understand the future without understanding the present and history. Like it just doesn't happen. Right. And so like we have to do that. And then we have to say like, okay, these giants, how do we take from each and craft and imagine and innovate new space? And I think a lot of times like that's, you know, that's what's missing. We have to fiercely hold on to our independence. We have to fiercely hold on to our, you know, intellectual genealogy. And we have to also fiercely hold on to just the fight that we know has to happen in all of these different times.
I think that's brilliant. This is why I love having you in my discussions with me. Like I feel so grounded when I'm able to talk to you about these things because you understand the history, the politics, the philosophy of Black liberation all wrapped up in one. And you're an educator. This is my thing is like, as a non-educator, I look at my educators and I want them to have what you just displayed in this hour, right? Like this background, this understanding that we can be great on our own. Not just that we can, but we should be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate being on. I appreciate you, not only the platform, but also your, your relentless push for education of our children. There are a lot of people who, who get nervous and want to stay mum to facts on the ground, like not even things that are just like, crazy, outlandish, like just calling out the facts, shining the light on what needs to be illuminated. And I appreciate that. And I take no credit. What I can say is I went to elementary school that gave me enough education to live my life. I think my kindergarten to sixth grade education was strong enough to set me on a trajectory to think intellectually about our people for a lifetime. And it was an independent Black school, full of and only full of Black teachers who were community members.
You mean a Black school that could teach people? Oh,
yeah,
wow. Really?
The disaster that sounds like that. People try to portray it as like that's, and it's not just me. It's so many of my classmates who are out there just doing amazing work. Dr. Ayla Stanford, doing amazing work. Who, and it goes back to that independence. She's like, oh, you're not testing in our community. We're dying at a higher rate. I'm setting up testing labs in North Philadelphia, where I grew up. Right, like that's like that kind of activism and support that's grounded in our community. Like that's exactly what education is.
Well, Christina Laster says that this is a conversation that should continue, and I guarantee you guys that that's what we are planning to do. This isn't the most structured way of learning, but Freedom Fridays will continue, and me and Sharif are going to look for the gems in history to talk about, to bring to unearth, and to have a communal conversation about the things that we should rescue and save. Darren Beck asked, "You recorded this, right?" And the answer to that is yes. We will have this out later today on both YouTube and on the podcast. So look for it there, and I'll share it out. Sharif, you can share it out too. Yep. We also mentioned some resources in this, and we'll do a good job of making sure that we continue to make note of the resources and get them out to folks in terms of books, documents, and things they should take a look at. In this discussion, I've dropped a few things, but one of them into the comments, but one of the things is a timeline of Black education that I have on my website at citizenstewart.com. There's a link at the top that says timeline, and it's a timeline of Black education that might have some dates that you care about. As always, I want to thank everybody who has taken the time this morning to listen and to comment and contribute to the discussion and to share it with other people. And if you're listening to this after it has been recorded, thank you for listening also and sharing it with friends and family. Sharif, thank you as always for being on with us again.
Freedom Fridays.
Freedom Fridays. Gonna make it happen.